Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Phil Mackintosh, chief economist at Nasdaq, for an update on the latest COVID-19 news, the U.S. and global economies, and how investors are modeling out the impact of the coronavirus as we focus on getting back to work. Now, Phil, U.S. private payrolls dropped by 20.2 million in April, the worst job loss in the history of the ADP report, with the biggest losses in services and hospitality. Not much of a surprise there. Do you think the market is starting to look at this as the bottom, since this encompassed all of April numbers?
Well, I guess the reality is these numbers expected, even though they're incredibly large compared to what historically. The forecast, the new jobless is going to still be pretty extensive as we go through the next few weeks. But obviously, the majority of the shutdown happened in the middle, as you say, and so this is kind of the trail of people getting into the jobless queue. It's a few people getting back into the jobless queue, because if you add up all of the jobless we've seen, it's around about 10 million more than the actual continuing claims. So I think the story is still going to look pretty ugly on the headlines for a few more weeks. But at the end of the day, we're starting to open up the economy. There is some signs of energy usage increasing. There's obviously some shops that are opening up. And so I think we should start to see improvement in the data in the next week or so as well.
Now, if we take a look at our first chart here today, this one's pretty interesting. It's a longer-term look, country by country, using phone data to see what mobility looks like.
Yeah, and I thought what was interesting here is you can see the different approaches that a lot of the countries have taken, and we can take a look in a minute about how successful each of those approaches have been. But obviously, phone data is one of the products people are talking about using for tracking as well, so that we can keep track of who we might have come in contact with if one of them becomes COVID positive, and we can put just isolated people into isolation, not shut down the whole economy again. But you can see that Asia in particular, even though it's the epicenter geographically, really didn't have that much slowdown, that much red throughout the period of Q1, Q2. And I think that's because they've seen this before. And if you've ever traveled in Asia, you realize a lot of people put masks on pretty quickly when they get the flu or a cold. And so culturally, it's quite different. And I think they've learned how to protect themselves and protect everybody from spreading things like this before they get out of control. The flip side is obviously countries like Italy, we know well, had a significant increase in cases and had to shut the economy down pretty aggressively and for weeks and weeks at a time. And so, the totally different approaches to how we do this from a sort of Western countries versus Eastern countries point of view.
All right, and let's walk us through the next three slides here, because we can really see that in the data that you provided with unified, ununified, and proactive approaches.
Yeah, so if you read about how the different countries have approached tackling coronavirus cases, I think you could sort of group the US and Canada and the UK into the not very unified approach. We haven't done a very good job of having protective equipment for medical staff. We haven't had a whole lot of capacity ready in hospitals. We haven't had very good testing in advance. We probably mostly still don't. And we've had a bit of a laissez-faire approach to lockdowns, especially in the US, where some states never locked down or didn't lock down to the same degrees as others right next to them. And so you can see these three countries have mostly looked like they've obviously flattened the curve, but they haven't crushed the curve. So we're still bouncing around in the US at around about 30,000 new cases a day. It's trending down, but it's not trending down that.
And then if we look at the next set of slides here, countries with the unified approach, you can see that significant decline.
Yeah, so don't you see a big difference here? I mean, Italy, which we talked about before, having a really aggressive isolation program, when they started to flatten the curve, the curve actually started to decrease pretty much. Their new cases now are around about 25% of their peak levels. Where in America, we're running not much under 10% down from peak levels. Australia and New Zealand are two other countries that we've talked about. They tackled it really early on. They tackled it pretty aggressively, even though the Australian movement data didn't really indicate that. And they managed to completely crush the curve. New Zealand is talking about having potentially got rid of coronavirus completely. And Australia has obviously got very few new cases per day. So it's a good example of success via isolation.
Yeah, it certainly is. And if we look at the following slide here, these are countries with testing, with masks. They have good hospital capacity. Although I noticed something on the Taiwan slide, there was that one obscure bump at the far right of the chart.
Yeah, but the reason I've circled Taiwan is it's just such a low number of cases anyway. I mean, it doesn't get above 30 per day. So compared to America, which is seeing 30,000 per day, Taiwan has had an incredible success at stopping it from getting into their country. I guess because they're in Asia, they're used to having heat guns at airports, tracking for this kind of thing already. They managed to stop a lot of the imported cases, and they've managed to tackle a lot of the cases quickly enough that they haven't become hotspots like we've seen in the States, like we've seen in the UK. South Korea, as we know, had a hotspot. They were kind of lucky that it was naturally, sort of geographically isolated just because it was a religious group. And they've managed to get tracking and testing and keep track of where the new cases pop up and tackle it that way. And then Germany is an interesting case because it had quite a lot of cases, but it also has a pretty good hospital system. So their death rate's been much lower than a lot of other countries in the world, which just speaks to the fact that you can have a more open country and more cases, but you don't want to stress the medical system, because if the medical system is well equipped, you actually don't have the mortality that you've seen in other countries with this virus.
All right, and to wrap up here, our final chart of the day, looking at Americans returning to work.
Yeah, so the obviously the American states are opening up one by one, but you can see that in the next month or so, we should be pretty much fully open. The real question is going to be, are all of us willing to get back on public transport to get back to work? Or will humans just naturally isolate themselves as long as they possibly can, or as long as they feel necessary? There's a lot of data coming out of China showing that people still aren't getting on subways. They're still not getting on trains. Planes we talked about recently have seen a slight uptick, but obviously from extremely low levels. And so I think, even if the government say we're all back to business, it's quite another thing whether we actually are all back to business. And then longer term, the real question is, has our spending activity changed? Will we be adopting Instacarts and deliveries more than before? Will we be wanting to travel like before? And if so, when? That's all the stuff that's still a question to be answered.
All right, Phil, great to have you with us as always. Thanks so much for joining me on Trade Talks.
Thanks for having me, Jill.
All right, thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.